Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
When I was in college and I was struggling with miracles and supernaturalism, and I put a penny on edge on my dresser, and I said, God, if you exist, just knock the penny over, and then I'll know you're there, and then I can proceed by faith. So my roommates came in bouncing a basketball into my room. And the penny fell over. And I said, oh, he ruined my experiment. And I said, well, maybe that was God who chose to have my roommate come in.
Well, and I think the important point is that we as Christians are constantly aware, and we should be made aware, that's why we're called to fellowship with each other, that God is a part of our daily life.
Yeah.
So that we don't need to have supernatural tricks. And I think the penny on it, it's like, oh no, I'm not going to believe unless you show me a trick.
Yeah.
And it reduces the supernatural to the magical. Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Crystal Downing, joined by my co-director of the Wade, David Downing, and our producer and resident theologian, Aaron Hill. As many of you know, we recently had a conversation with Jerry Root about Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, which landed him on the cover of Time magazine. And today we plan to discuss a book that C.S. Lewis wrote as a result of Screwtape Letters. And let me explain how that happened. Dorothy Sayers, whom C.S. Lewis identified as one of the most important influences on his spiritual life, initiated a relationship via letters with C.S. Lewis in May of 1943, sending him a copy of her recently published collection of radio plays about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And with the copy of the radio plays, which was called Man Born to be King, she included a fanciful letter inspired by the Screwtape Letters of Lewis. And Sayers loved Screwtape Letters. And she sets the letter up as though it were a devil, as in Screwtape Letters, only her devil is named Sluckdrib, who has a clerk named Swiltosh, and he is writing to make a memorandum about his frustrations in temptation. So very similar to Screwtape Letters.
Oh.
And in this fanciful letter, which she sends to C.S. Lewis, she has Sluckdrib say about someone who listened to her radio plays. A sound atheist of the old-fashioned materialist kind wrote my patient, and the patient here, of course, is Dorothy Sayers.
Gotcha.
So Sluckdrib is her personal demon.
Mm-hmm.
A old-fashioned materialist wrote my patient a highly offensive letter about miracles, accusing her of ignorance and dishonesty in the vulgarest language. I persuaded her to answer it still more rudely and offensively. This should have inflamed the situation. Instead, the man seemed pleased to be taken notice of. So this person who had written her letter was named L.T. Duff, and he listened to the radio plays because they had created this scandal among Protestants, and Sayers didn't use King James English. So all these non-Christians listened thinking that these plays were going to demythologize the miraculous nature of Christianity.
Gotcha.
And then he listened to it, and what he heard was the gospel message. And so he writes her and says, you're an Oxford-educated person. How could you possibly believe in miracles?
Oh.
And so he was very offensive. She was kind of offensive back, and she describes this in her Sluckdrib letter. And then she puts something in her own hand to Lewis and says, that's what my attendant demon wrote. Meanwhile, I am left with the atheist on my hands. I do not want him. I have no use for him. I have no missionary zeal at all. God is behaving with his usual outrageous lack of scruple. The man keeps on bothering about miracles. If he reads any of the books I have recommended, he will write me long and disorderly letters about them. It will go on for years. I cannot bear it. 2 of the books I recommended are yours. I only hope they will rouse him to fury. Then I shall hand him on to you. You like souls. I don't. And she goes on. Well, and she draws little pictures. Lewis was obviously delighted. He actually told Sayers that she was one of the great British letter writers of all time.
Oh, wow.
But most exciting of all is 4 days later, after Lewis got this parody of screw tape letters from Sayers, Lewis wrote Sayers to say, I have started a book on miracles.
Oh.
So Walter Hooper believes that this is the origin of miracles. So let's talk about this important book that Sayers inspired. And I think the first question, and I'll direct this to you, David, is that the title of the book is Miracles, but then the subtitle is a preliminary study. What did Lewis mean by that?
Well, he wants to make sure that you're starting out with proper philosophical assumptions before you look at historical inquiry. If you say, did Jesus really turn water into wine? Did Jesus really bring Lazarus back from the dead? You could do some sort of historical inquiry, but if you assume there's no supernaturalism, you might as well not even bother to look at the historical evidence. He's great at starting out books and essays. He says, I only met one person who thought she had seen a ghost, but she disbelieved it. She thought it was an eye strain. I think he's thinking of Mrs. Moore.
Oh,
I talked
really?
last time about how she gave him a lot of material.
I was wondering who that person was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember picking this up for the first time when I was starting to read more C.S. Lewis apologetic books, and I picked it up thinking it was going to be just that. He was going to talk about the historical evidence for...
Right.
Because I had read Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter and those kinds of books,
Right.
and I picked it up, and the first 9 or 10 chapters is just him engaging with materialism and laying down all these philosophical arguments. He doesn't really get to talking about miracles till the very end of the book, and then it's just the incarnation.
Yeah, what he means by preliminary study is you have to decide if miracles are even possible philosophically.
Yeah.
When you have a woman who claims to have seen a ghost, but then she herself doesn't believe her eyes, then what's the point of looking at empirical evidence?
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Well,
when people
I don't
say,
understand that incident. Explain that. How can she claim she saw a ghost and then claim she didn't see a
Well,
ghost?
she thought she had the experience of seeing a ghost, but she didn't believe her own eyes because she didn't believe in ghosts.
Oh.
So it must have been
Oh.
indigestion.
So she had an experience, but it wasn't, she didn't actually see a ghost because ghosts aren't real. So
Right,
she was seeing
right.
something
Right.
else.
So her presuppositions made her deny her own experience.
Once again, believing is seeing or not seeing.
Well, I was going to say, he says in
Right.
that opening chapter, he says, seeing is not believing.
Right.
Which
Yeah.
we've talked about in the last couple
Yeah.
podcasts.
Well, in the Gospels, when they see Lazarus raised from the dead, their immediate thought is, we've got to get rid of this person. They don't go, wow, that person came back from the dead. I need to rethink my worldview. Rather, they literally, and if you have someone whose friend can bring them back from the dead, the idea
Yeah.
of trying to murder him seems a little futile. So Lewis doesn't get into individual miracles as much as philosophically. He says the philosophy we bring to experience determines how we interpret our experience.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's why he calls it a preliminary study.
Yeah.
He wants to talk philosophically about naturalism and supernaturalism.
Right.
There's a really good example of that in our recent culture here in America, which is the Pentagon is about to release a UFO report in June, and everybody's been talking about it, and there's been videos that the military has released about these unidentified flying objects, and they had a whole 60-minute special, and these people
Right.
were sharing testimonies of seeing these things, and I gotta be honest, I don't believe in UFOs, so I hear this stuff and I think, well, their radar must be messing up, or
Right.
something else been going on. It can't be aliens. And so because I don't believe that UFOs exist, this report's going to come out in June, and I'm probably going to approach it like Mrs. Moore with the ghost and be like, and try and explain it away rather than,
Right. Right.
dealing with the evidence as it is. So yeah, our preconceptions frame it for us and we immediately write things off. That UFO thing has just been in the news lately, so I thought about it.
Right. I just read a debunking article about that. The writer thought it was a Canadian goose that was flying, but it was at such distance and kissing the sun. He thinks they all have to do with long distance photography.
Oh.
When you change the focal length, it appears to, shoot off into
Yeah.
space in a different direction.
Yeah, so it
so
is
the
interesting.
debunkers will be in abundance.
Exactly. And we're going to be engaging in this practice, but with UFOs, not with miracles. So yeah.
Lewis talks about clearing up the philosophical presuppositions, and then he wants to talk about, in our ordinary life, our our reasoning is a kind of supernatural gift. Our ability to interpret reality through reason is a piece of eternity in our consciousness, and also our moral judgment. Moral judgment can't be reduced to just altruism or evolution. So he starts saying, in many ways, before you see an actual miracle, you have the miracle of reasoning and you have the miracle of moral judgment, which suggests that there's something eternal in our consciousness, even before we would see water turned into wine or see someone healed.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting in his tactics insofar as he is criticizing naturalists who say, well, miracles just aren't reasonable. And so he's tackling the whole idea of reason itself. And he uses a very similar technique, as does Sayers with this L.T. Duff, who criticized her intelligence because she believes in miracles. And she wrote him a letter before she wrote C.S. Lewis, the Slugrib letter. She told him, admittedly, we cannot prove that the universe is rational, for the only instrument by which we can prove anything is reason, and we have to assume the rationality of things before we can trust or use our reason. But every act and word of our daily life, not to mention all art and science, are based on that assumption. Without that act of faith, we could not live or act. So reason itself, and this is one of the main points Lewis keeps reiterating, reason itself is something that we take on faith, that reason is reliable, but the only way we could verify its reliability is if it is made by a transcendent creator rather than just the result of evolutionary processes.
Right. Yeah. And this is one of his most controversial passages. He says if a reason is simply development of evolution, of irrational causes, of favorable mutations, then how do we know that our thoughts are actually related to reality? Now, this is when he had a famous debate with G.E.M. Anscombe, the Catholic Wittgensteinian philosopher, and she took him to task for using the word irrational in two different ways. One is the irrational forces of evolution. It's simply happening by accident that there are favorable mutations which increase chances of survival. And the other is irrational, meaning not logical. So it's kind of equivocating on irrational, meaning cause and effect with no consciousness. The way pool balls move around the pool table is irrational, or I should say irrational, because they are predictable, but they're not making conscious decisions.
Yeah.
Whereas children playing tag, they're all making conscious decisions about whether to run away or whether to dodge. So they had a famous debate in which she thought that he was equivocating on the key term. Now, actually, there's a good book by Victor Reppert called C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea, in which he develops Lewis's idea and adds in some Plantinga and some other philosophers. And he mentions that Darwin worried about this. Lewis mentions that J.B.S. Haldane worried about it. Chesterton also brought it up. So it really bears looking into whether or not we can trust our reason if it's simply a evolutionary development through the millennia.
Yeah, Alvin Plantinga actually has done a lot of work with that argument. That's actually where I first encountered it.
Me too.
Before I read Lewis. And I think he handles it, he kind of gets around that objection about the irrationality thing and basically says, if we can trust it, then our reason is just optimized for survival, not for finding the truth, but for survival. And so that means we can't use it to reason about things that don't have to do with survival. So he kind of gets around that objection. And I think it's a very good argument, actually. But it doesn't necessarily, if you believe that some people believe that that God, ordained evolution and is behind it the whole time, then they would say then it's not irrational, that there is a sort of reason that is directing evolution. And so obviously people disagree about that within Christianity, but some people get around that argument by embracing evolution but saying that God is the sort of author behind it. Francis Collins is a famous example.
Right. And even Lewis somewhat suggests it. And once again, throughout this book, and here we go again, he suggests a both-and scenario. And he actually says, yes, there is both uniformity and miracle. And so he refuses to reduce things to either or. And that's the trouble with naturalists. They just say that miracles are impossible, but they've decided in advance that they are impossible. And what's ironic is when people like L.T. Duff confront Sayers, or when I went to grad school, and obviously most reputable Research One institutions are secular grad schools, and people, when they found out I was a Christian, one of my grad school colleagues said, "Wow, Crystal, you're the first Christian I've ever met who is the least bit intelligent." Because he's decided in advance you can't be intelligent and believe in miracles. And the irony is they assume a believer in miracles has a narrow worldview. But when you think of it, someone who believes both in the uniformity of natural processes and in miracles has a much larger worldview. You acknowledge, and as Lewis does here, you acknowledge that there is, and he implies an evolutionary process right in this book, but that the supernatural can invade. And I like the word that he uses, invade, rather than subvert or undermine. That no, he says God, the creator of the universe, is sustaining the natural processes that God, the creator, put into process. But then at these certain moments, he invades by, and he says many times just by speeding up the process.
Yeah.
Kind of like water under natural uniformitarian processes will eventually turn into wine if you add grapes to it.
And seal it off with no oxygen.
Right. God just sped it up at the wedding of Cana.
Yeah.
He got that idea from George MacDonald. One of George MacDonald's sermons is about how many of the miracles of the New Testament, they're what nature does all the time writ large, but they're speeded up and they're applied to a particular situation.
Oh.
Yeah, that was interesting. I like his emphasis upon there aren't laws of nature. There's only observed regularities.
Yes.
One time when Crystal, you and I were in England, we were eating in an outdoor patio and the tide was coming in. And so the water in the river next to the patio was going upstream.
Oh, yeah.
And this little child said, Mommy, the river's flowing upstream. And she said, well, that's the tide is coming in and that's pushing the water. So to the child, it was a miracle because water flows downstream.
Yeah.
But the mother knew about another principle, which was, tidal attractions, which is actually stronger than gravity in this case.
Yeah.
And I think he's looking at miracles that way a lot. There's an observed regularity, but occasionally God interferes or introduces a new factor into the formula.
Yeah, he gives two definitions of miracles in the book. Well, he mentions it in a couple ways, but in chapter 2, he says that they are an interference with nature by supernatural power. And then later on in the book, he says that it's something contrary to the natural course of events. So he kind of refines it a little bit.
Right.
But he also uses that language of intrusion or invasion a lot as he goes through the book. I would say that's, I don't know, and this is just me, but I think to me that's one of the challenges that I have with this definition of miracles is he sort of, in trying to refute materialism, he kind of buys into this framework where you have the natural and the supernatural, and the two normally don't have anything to do with one another. But then somehow God is underneath it as a layer, but it involves intrusion into the natural world. And so buying into that dichotomy, I think, is this modern problem that we've created. If you read John Walton or any Old Testament scholars, they'll tell you that ancient people in the Old Testament, they didn't see the world that way. They didn't, there was no sort of division between, well, that's where, God is, he's over here and we're over here, and the two don't meet, and a miracle is an intrusion. So they would have said about everything that happened, God did that. And you see that laid out in the book of Job. It feels like it's a modern problem that we've created by going through and labeling everything as natural, and nature does this on her own without any interference from God. But then you see in the Bible where it says that God causes it to rain, and he causes the grain to grow up in the harvest. Right. And God seems to be involved in everything in the Bible, but then we as modern people go, oh, but what about this very special thing that happened here? That must have been an intrusion.
Yeah, Lewis wrote a good essay. He got that idea from Barfield that in ancient times, everything was supernatural. They didn't say this is natural and this is supernatural. But slowly, first the external world became emptied of dryads and gods and thunder beings and all that. And so the external world became more and more natural. And then eventually that consciousness, the internal world, became more and more natural. We are not made in the image of God. We simply are a collection of brain processes and neural firing. So it's an interesting theory. They struggled in some ways. They had no sense of naturalism. Everything was supernatural.
Yeah.
Many moderns have no sense of supernaturalism. Everything is natural.
He says in the book that he kind of articulates when he says the natural is what springs up or comes forth or arrives or goes on of its own accord. The given, what is already there, the spontaneous, the unintended, the unsolicited. So the idea is that nature will just do those things without any outside interference. But at the same time, as Christians, we believe that God does somehow do all those things. And so we've kind of embraced this dichotomy as well. And I think part of that wrestling is something that I think is, we bought into this framework where we've kind of isolated God from our everyday life.
Right, right.
Yeah. And part of it, too, has to do with cheesy proclamations of miracles. Lewis, even in this book, says that most miracle stories are false. So people want to invent like, the Holy Spirit appeared in a tortilla.
Or the Mary appeared on a piece of toast or something.
Yeah, exactly. Or we have some friends who grew up as Christians and in the Roman Catholic tradition, but they just kept having their family perpetuate problematic assumptions. Like one time, and they're older than us, so that means they're really old, but those milk bottles that milkmen used to bring to your house. I suppose they still do that. And they had this paper tab that you would pull out of the neck of the milk bottle before you poured it.
Oh.
And so somehow it got dropped onto a kitchen floor, and an aunt came in and saw this round wafer thing saying, "The body of Christ, the body of Christ," because it looked exactly like the wafers that were served during Mass.
An aunt came in.
Yes.
Not the insect. For just a second.
Oh, yeah.
That would be a miracle.
I was like, wow, the ant confessed it was the body of Christ.
And so I really like what Lewis is trying to do here by saying, okay, we have to give better definition of miracles themselves so that we don't have these problematic desires to fill regular life with the supernatural. And he defines, okay, there's 6 different types of miracles. A lot of miracle stories are just fanciful mythology, the way miracle stories were before Christianity.
Yeah, he says a lot of stories involve lies and exaggeration in general. Yeah, I came home, we were having a discussion in my theology class at Wheaton about miracles, and I came home and there was a smiley face on my countertop, and I thought, where in the world did this come from? I was perplexed by it. I took a picture of it, and I thought, is God trying to send me a message that I need to cheer up or something? And then I realized later that my wife had left a round measuring spoon on the counter. She set it down and some stuff fell out. And so it made a round portion, and then by the handle, some fell out in little, look like eyes. But I had this moment, this existential moment. I'm like, is God sending me a message? Is this a miracle? And I was like, oh no, it was just my wife set the measuring spoon down on the counter. But
right.
I had one of those when I was in college and I was struggling with miracles and supernaturalism. And I put a penny on edge on my dresser. And I said, God, if you exist, just knock the penny over, and then I'll know you're there, and then I can proceed by faith.
Yeah.
And so my roommates came in bouncing a basketball into my room. And the penny fell over. And I said, oh, he ruined my experiment. And then I said, well, maybe that was God who chose to have my roommate come in bouncing a basketball. So these are the kind of conundrums we get into. Exactly.
Well, and I think the important point is that we as Christians are constantly aware, and we should be made aware, that's why we're called to fellowship with each other, that God is a part of our daily life.
Yeah.
So that we don't need to have supernatural tricks. And I think the penny on edge, it's like, oh no, I'm not going to believe unless you show me a trick.
Yeah.
And it reduces the supernatural to the magical.
Yeah.
That's something Lewis warns against, that we are aware that our Creator is available to us, and we can be constantly in conversation with God, and God has revealed God's self through the Scripture.
Yeah, and that's why God could actually be sending me a message to cheer up, even though it was just my wife setting the thing down on the counter. Those two things can be true.
God
it can be both
use,
and, not either
natural
or.
processes.
So one of the things Lewis talks about in this book at length, and he's very qualified to talk about, is the difference between how ancient people thought and how modern people think, and how we've used our bad ideas about how the way ancient people thought to sort of excuse away miracles. So let's talk about that a little bit. What are some of the things that he talks about with ancient people? He mentions two red herrings in the book. One of them is that ancient people didn't know the laws of nature. And so because they didn't understand the laws of nature, they just made up these stories about things, the way things happen, and that's a miracle. And therefore we don't have to believe that because we know better now. We know that how magnets work and how electricity works and things like that. What else does he talk about related to sort of ancient people and the way they thought in the book?
Well, I think that one you just mentioned is important because there's plenty of evidence in the Bible that Joseph understood that a young maiden shouldn't be pregnant, so he wanted to put her away. He didn't need to consult a gynecologist to find out that was unusual. And when Lazarus is in the tomb and Jesus says, well, I'm going to bring him back, they say, he's been there for 3 days. He stinks.
Yeah.
So you don't need to have a scientific explanation to know how natural processes work. By the way, red herrings, it's a metaphor from hunting, that a red herring is a cured herring that you drag across the path to confuse the hunting dogs.
Oh.
They get the fish smell and then they can't smell the fox.
Yeah.
So I spent years wondering why they were called red herrings. I finally looked it up.
Oh, okay.
It's something that distracts you from your true task and takes you off in the wrong direction.
It is interesting because it's a metaphor that we use that is very old and is not something that occurs in our daily life. Yeah. Another concept in the book that I thought was interesting is he gives a story about the little girl who thinks that poison, her mother tells her not to eat something because it's poisonous, and she thinks that there's horrid red things in there.
Right.
What is he talking about there? I thought that was an interesting little
I think that's the other red herring is people think that we have to get away from metaphorical language. We have to, we can't say he came down from heaven because heaven is not above us. So we have to say he entered into the natural sphere, but it's still a metaphor of movement from one place to another.
Yeah.
So he says all language is intrinsically metaphorical. And even if people have a metaphor in mind, which isn't necessarily accurate, they can still have the correct concept. The little girl knew that it was poison, even though she thought metaphorically poison meant full of horrid red things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like the one about the little girl where they said God is a substance. And she started thinking of it as tapioca pudding. And what made it worse is she didn't like tapioca pudding. Yeah.
Right. And that is part of the problem with the naturalist argument insofar as they are naive about their own language.
Oh, okay.
In my recent exploration of Sayers, I was looking at quantum leaps of subatomic particles.
Oh, wow.
And I think Lewis even mentions quantum mechanics.
He talks about Schrodinger and quantum theory.
Exactly.
We need to get to that and talk about it.
And so there's the sense, well, scientists have discovered the truth of natural processes. But even scientists don't agree. And so Einstein questioned quantum leaps, and the idea is that some subatomic particle leaps from one orbit around the nucleus to another. So scientists have gone back and forth, and the most recent scientific discoveries say no. Quantum leaps was a construction that we have evidence is no longer applicable, that it is a slow transition. So the leap has to do with the human perception of what is happening. And so a lot of this issue of miracles is about human perception and the fact that our thought processes are guided by language. And Lewis reiterates that part of the problem is with our language itself. One of my favorite passages in the whole book, he says, he's talking about God and says, most certainly beyond all worlds, unconditioned and unimaginable, transcending discursive thought. In other words, thought, which is shaped by discourse, transcending discursive thought. There yawns forever the ultimate fact, the fountain of all other facthood, the burning and undimensioned depth of the divine life, that God transcends language. And both Christians on one extreme, they mimic non-Christians, anti-Christians on the other extreme, where they think their language is innocent and not thinking about that God transcends our ability to fully capture him in our language.
Well, and I think the other thing he's trying to get at in that chapter, which he titles Horrid Red Things, is he says at the beginning of the chapter, he said, Christian theology would never have come into existence at all if the writers of the New Testament had had the slightest knowledge of what the real universe is actually like. In other words, that's the assumption. But his argument is, just because you can crack open the little tablet and show the child that there are no horrid red things inside of it doesn't mean that there's no such thing as poison, right? You can refute the metaphor. We can send somebody into space and discover that, oh, wait, there is no old guy up here sitting in a chair. Therefore, I've disproved the existence of God.
Yeah.
And Lewis's point is, no, you've proven that metaphor is not an accurate description of where God is or how he rules over the world, but that doesn't mean that you've disproven who God is. And so he says in the book, he says, it is one thing to refute a mental image of poison being red. It is another to conclude that there is no such thing as poison.
Right.
And I think that's a really good point that he makes in the book that you commonly see when people have discussions about not just miracles, but religious things in general and doctrines. And people they attack the metaphor and then assume that they've, disproven the thing in general.
Right.
Right. I remember there was a Russian cosmonaut who, in the early days of space exploration, says, I went out to space and I looked for God and I didn't see him. And somebody wrote at the time, well, I should have noticed his own image in the mirror, because that's a better image of God, human beings, than empty space would be.
Yeah. He gives three guiding principles, and I think the second one to me was the interesting one. He says that our thoughts, which are communicated through these metaphors, may be sound even if the images that accompany our thoughts are mistaken for the truer ones. So even though we can't communicate these things in the proper way and we have to use these clumsy metaphors, we can still be talking about something that's true even if our mental image is wrong. He gives the example of thinking about London, and he thinks about this train station.
Yeah, Euston Station.
Even though he says, clearly that's not London. But in my mind, when I think about London, that's what I think about. But that doesn't mean that London doesn't exist. There is no such thing as London.
It's a synecdoche. It's a type of metaphor.
Yeah.
And we all think that way, including the most rigorous scientists.
Yeah.
This point, and this is what proves how brilliant C.S. Lewis was, he's anticipating what theorists started talking about in the 1960s and 70s, often called postmodern theorists, and this idea that of something being both medicine and poison, going back to the little red things chapter. The word pharmakon means, from the Greek, means both medicine and poison. It is both and.
Really?
And I was so interested then when Lewis talks about death. He says it is Satan's great weapon and also God's great weapon. It is holy and unholy, our supreme disgrace and our only hope. The both and of death, which is like the both and of the pharmakon. It is medicine and poison. And that's, of course, where we get our word pharmacy from.
Yeah.
And sure enough, if you take certain medicines, if you take them inappropriately, they will kill you.
Yeah.
Something that can heal you can also kill you. And what is interesting about, there's a famous essay called Plato's Pharmacy, where Plato basically was suspicious of metaphor. And so Jacques Derrida wrote this essay saying, no, Plato didn't realize that language can be both and in terms of medicine and poison. But then he makes this amazing point that is so consonant with what Lewis is doing in Miracles, saying, and Plato forgot there is another meaning of pharmakos that's related to this, which means a scapegoat or sacrifice.
Ooh.
And Lewis makes that point as well, saying all miracles relate to the grand miracle, which is the Incarnation, where Jesus both dies and lives again. Jesus is the ultimate pharmacon.
Interesting.
I think poison and potion, don't those come from the same root in the French?
I don't know. That would make sense.
It's a modern example of that. When my nephews was little, his mother pulled up to a drugstore and it said drugs right out front. And this little kid says, "Mommy, say no to drugs." His idea was the word, drug. That can either be for healing or it can be dangerous.
It's both poison and medicine.
Definitely.
Yeah.
One of the chapters that stood out to me reading it this last time, given everything that we've discussed about Lewis and Romanticism, is his chapter where he talks about this objection that he used to have to miracles as it relates to creation or nature. And he really hated the idea that there was this God who designed nature and creation and that it was this kind of like machine-like thing and it was predictable and it took away the wildness and the unpredictability that he felt like was in nature. And he talks about that in the book. And I thought that was a very interesting thing that so obviously very personal to him, that he wanted nature to retain this wildness and not be sort of tamed by being this pet or something that had been created by God and that was tame. And so I thought that was a very interesting chapter that because he's not really, he actually says you could skip this chapter if you want. This is sort of a objection that I used to have and how he deals with it.
But isn't it wonderful how he relates that to the grand miracle as well? And it goes back to the pharmacon, that the sacrifices are inherently part. So death is inherently a part of life in the nature that God created. So I look at outside in the spring and see a robin who is basically pulling a worm out of the ground. Now that worm is good for the ground. There's some people who buy worms, to aerate their grounds. The robin eats it, but then you can watch and sometimes a hawk will swoop down and get the robin. And so this whole the ecology of creation itself, and even naturalists have to admit this, is based on the both and of death, that death is both poison. It's poison to the person or to the robin that dies, but it is life to the hawk that feeds off of him. So the miracle of the death and resurrection of Jesus has continuity with natural processes, with the pharmacon.
Right. And Lewis talks about miracles of the new creation. And in many ways, Christ is the first fruit of creation because he's the first one to be raised from the dead, as we all will be eventually in the end times. I love Lewis's metaphors.
Yes.
I love the metaphor of flatlanders. If you live in a two-dimensional world and a rubber ball comes bouncing across your two-dimensional world, you would say it was a miracle. First it appeared here, and then it appeared here, and then it appeared here.
Yeah.
But if you see the other dimension, you can see that it's simply a ball, bouncing several times across a two-dimensional plane.
Yeah, and he gives he mentions about the Trinity. It's almost like we know what a square is, but then to then talk about a cube. If you're a flatlander, it's like you can't even imagine what that would be because your world consists of two dimensions. To then talk about this three-dimensional object is impossible. That's actually a great novel to read, that Flatlander novel.
Flatland. Speaking of metaphors, some of the worst metaphors I heard growing up were about the Trinity. One of them said, well, it's like an egg. It's got a shell and a yolk and the whites. And I go, that's not at all like the Trinity. And another one I heard was, it's like water. It can be steam, or it can be water, or it can be ice. It can be solid, liquid, or vaporous.
That's also a heresy, actually.
Yeah, I know. Even as a kid, I said, that's not good theology. Just let it be a mystery. Don't try to give these really corny analogies.
To this problem of language that Lewis himself realizes he has to keep returning to. So here's another one of my favorite quotations where he says, God is unspeakable not by being indefinite, but by being too definite for the unavoidable vagueness of language.
Right.
Yeah.
So metaphors, it's pretty much all we got. But we have to keep assessing our metaphors, because what starts happening is people absolutize their metaphors, and they put more trust in the sign than in what the sign is supposed to point to.
Yeah.
I was thinking of this in terms, and Lewis brings it up several times in Miracles. He mentions how we can't literalize that phrase that Jesus is sitting on the right hand of the Father, so that we have to think, okay, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
No, that's a metaphor. And many of the problems in the history of Christianity is when people worship their metaphors more than they worship God.
Yeah.
And the whole Protestant Reformation, part of it was generated by a different interpretation of what Jesus meant when he said, "This is my body broken for you."
Yeah.
And of course, those who believe in transubstantiation, they literally believe that the blessed host is Christ's body, whereas Protestants say, no, this is a metaphor that points to what Jesus did for us.
Yeah, that's definitely a interesting thing about doctrine. Lewis talks about that in a couple other of his books about the atonement, where he essentially admits, theologians we're just coming up with metaphors to try and explain what Christ did and how he took away our sins by dying on the cross. But they're all just metaphors that we're trying to use to explain it. But ultimately, we just have to accept it on faith that what he did, because we don't really understand exactly how it works. But some people get so attached to a metaphor for how Christ took away our sins that they end up trying to defend that thing as opposed to the truth behind it.
Right.
Another chapter that he has in the book is where he talks extensively about pantheism.
Right.
Let's talk about that for a second. What is Lewis's point about pantheism and having to do with miracles?
I liked his point that pantheism is not New Age. It's not the most recent development of theology. It's actually the first guess that if humans have consciousness and animals are obviously sentient, then it seems that all of creation must have consciousness. So he makes the point that pantheism is not a New Age religion. It's the oldest of religions. It's the oldest guess as to the spiritual world. He said in a different book that pantheism is a kind of wish fulfillment because there's this spirituality, but it has no will or intention that makes you do anything.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like a book that you put back on the shelf when you're finished reading.
Feel-good religion.
Right.
Oh, God's all around me.
Yeah, it's the best of both worlds because you get the spiritualism, but without any obligation or conviction or anything like that.
It's kind of like, may the force be with you. Well, the force wants you to give all your money to the poor. What? The force... The force is making you do something. I think I mentioned this in an earlier podcast. He said, I do not deny pantheism because it affirms God's immanence. I deny it because it denies his transcendence.
Right.
So
transcending discursive thought.
Right. The divine can't be completely embodied in the physical world.
Yeah.
He says nature is actually a fellow creature, and to really appreciate nature, you have to go out of nature and look back and say, oh, that's what it is. It's not God. It's our sister, like St. Francis, Brother Moon and Sister Sun.
Yeah, he actually says that in that chapter, he says pantheism is in fact the permanent natural bent of the human mind. Right. And that Platonism, Judaism, and Christianity have proved the only things capable of resisting it. It's sort of, our fallback to stance. And that he also, I thought this was a really good point. He says when people try to embrace pantheism and they get into it and they study it as adults, they often go back and compare it to a version of Christianity that they were taught in their childhood. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially not a fair fight. It's you're taking this immature version of Christianity that you were taught as a kid and comparing it to these things that you think now as an adult. And he's sort of saying you need to go study the actual, Christian theology that adults believe and then make a proper comparison. It's, you need to pick a fair fight there.
Yeah, it's like my analogy of someone telling me the Trinity was like an egg. It's a bad analogy, but that doesn't change the theology of the Trinity. You just have to set aside that metaphor.
Yes.
Yeah.
He talks in one of his other books about magisterial metaphors versus pupillary. And one is designed for the pupil or the student. And so if a chemistry teacher says, this molecule is like a little solar system, there's a nucleus and then these electrons going around it. And he himself knows that they are not little solar systems.
Yeah.
But it really helps to figure out chemical bonding and that sort of thing. And I remember the first time I said, all that stuff we told you about circulating, we just made that up. It's not like that at all. They're actually clouds of probability. But other things, that's a metaphor you give to pupils to help them understand. But when physicists get to the nature of quantum mechanics and they say, are these particles or these waves? If you look at them one way, they seem to be little BBs hitting the nucleus, but another way, they just look like undulations.
Yeah.
And they're not really saying, well, that's just a metaphor we're giving you, but it's really this other thing. There is no other thing. They have to use those metaphors because they can't penetrate the mathematics except by using contradictory metaphors.
And, and it ties into human perception. So the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and a lot of people misinterpret that, think, oh, that's just saying that everything's uncertain. No, Heisenberg's point is that the action of even perceiving some subatomic processes can change them. So perception is part of our understanding of truth.
Yeah.
And that's why we need revelation.
Yeah. He makes a similar point in this book about, he gives an example of this Latin rule, which I'm not familiar with, something about hexameters. And he basically says, schoolboys are taught this rule in Latin, and then they go read Virgil, and he breaks that rule all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
And they think, oh, well, Virgil didn't learn the rules. But his point is, actually, Virgil knows the rules, and he's quote unquote breaking them on purpose, but it just actually shows that has a mastery of Latin. And his point is, sometimes we assume that these rules that we use to learn, how vegetation works or how wine is produced, and we assume that because that's how it works most of the time, that rule must always apply, and it's this sort of hard and fast limit. And then when we learn that Jesus made water out of wine out of water, or that a man was buried in the ground and then he rose again, we think that it was a violation of the rule. And he says, no, maybe God is this virtuoso that understands a higher set of rules. And he's actually doing things that we can't understand because we've just learned this Latin grammar rules for primary school kids. And we're not Virgil, but God is like a Shakespeare. Wouldn't he be more creative and do things that we can't understand and we can't comprehend? And we shouldn't think that God is violating a rule or breaking something when he's doing that. I thought it was a really good example.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
In fact, when you're teaching creative writing, students sometimes understand that it has to be iambic pentameter, but they become enslaved by that rule.
Yeah.
So everything they write is da 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 da, and becomes very mechanical.
Yeah.
And a good poet knows exactly when to bend the rules, add a syllable, add a spondee.
When my students would protest about English professors being so uptight about grammar rules, I would make this point. I say, you need to know the grammar rules so that you can break them on purpose. So that shows you are involved in the creative process rather than just being manipulated by the discursive practices of culture. But isn't that exactly what Lewis is getting at in this book, that God created this universe that follows what looks like certain rules, but then God intervenes in those rules to make a point. And what's fascinating is that every time the word miracle appears in English translations of the Bible, the Greek word is semeion, which means sign. Or it's a different Greek word that
means like wonder, like signs and wonders.
Yeah, signs and wonders.
Yeah, that's another word. And sometimes the word sign gets interpreted as a wonder. And another time, the Greek word is dunamis, from which we get dynamite,
like
which means power.
Right.
So even then, God reveals God's self in the Bible, but the trouble is we have to rely on interpreters. So sometimes an interpreter will interpret semeion as miracle. Sometimes they'll interpret it as literally sign. Sometimes they'll interpret it as wonder. In the King James Bible, the only time the word semeion is interpreted as miracle is in the Gospel of John.
Yeah.
Whenever the other gospel writers use semeion, it's not interpreted as miracle.
Yeah.
So there is another example of human perception molding even the way we understand how to talk about miracles.
Right.
It is about the fact that God transcends language, and our language isn't solid enough to be able to capture God.
Yeah, but it's also a glimpse of what I mentioned earlier about that ancient way of seeing the world, where there really wasn't a difference between the natural and the supernatural, that the power that made crops grow was God's power. And so if they grew faster or they grew differently, then that was just that power of God coming, peeking through in a new and interesting way. And if it stopped raining or their crops didn't grow, they knew who to go talk to when things went wrong, right? They didn't think, oh, I must have put too much nitrogen in the soil or whatever the case is. They actually thought, oh, we need to go talk to the God who is the power behind our crops growing and causes it to rain. And so that worldview, they just saw everything differently.
I like his analogy of causation, that in Hamlet, when Ophelia dies, is it because the branch broke and she fell into the stream? Or is it because the author said, well, it's time to get rid of this character in order to forward the tragic movement of the play?
Right. It's
and
both
I think what you're talking about, naturalists would say, well, the branch broke. And supernaturalists would tend to say, well, God realized the author realized it was time for this character to depart from the play.
Yeah.
So, I like that analogy with causation. You can always frame it within the story, or you can frame it from outside the story.
Well, and I have to insert one of my favorite lines in Miracles, where Lewis refers to Dorothy Sayers' book,
I was going to mention that.
The Mind of the Maker, as indispensable.
Yeah.
And when he gives that example of Shakespeare and deciding how Ophelia dies, so that Shakespeare becomes an image of a creator, a maker. And so Lewis Sayers' book title, Mind of the Maker, she's referring to God, and then referring to the fact that humans are created in the image of God. Our creativity fulfills the Imago Dei, and Imago Dei just means the image of God. So Lewis has obviously learned from Sayers to use this idea of the Imago Dei as a type of metaphor to understand our own maker.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I misread that. He said it was an indispensable book?
Yes.
I thought he said it was an indefensible book.
Bad.
It's interesting. Yeah, he gives the example from Sayers of if you conjure up some unusual event to get your character out of a hole that you've written them into, that's just lazy. That's bad writing. And that's often how people perceive miracles, as if God has to fix something, and he sort of wrote himself into a hole. And he says, but the unusual event is perfectly permissible if it is what you are really writing about. It's an artistic crime if you simply drag it in by the heels to get yourself out of a hole. But if that's what the story is about from the beginning, then it's perfectly reasonable for you to have that happen. And he also gives the example of a friend of his writing a book about trees or something. And the professor is like, take the part about the trees out. And he's like, well, that's the whole point of the book,
Right. Well, in literary studies, a contrived ending is called Deus ex machina.
Right.
The God out of the machine.
Yeah,
You're watching a play where the hero has been struck down and his sword is broken and he's surrounded by his enemies. And you want him to either give an eloquent speech for mercy or you want him to beat them up just with his sword hilt. But suddenly you go, and this goddess comes out of the clouds and says, please come up on the platform and I'll take you back up to the heavens. And that's a very unsatisfying ending when you inject the supernatural that way.
Yeah.
In fact, David, you once read a book on screenwriting, and the screenwriters said, you shouldn't have more than one dream sequence in a movie. Then when you revise your screenplay, take out that one dream sequence. Because dream sequences are often deus ex machina, that a person is pulled awake. So it generates, this excitement. Oh, I can't believe this is happening to them. And then we find out it's just a dream. And it's just pure manipulation.
When I taught creative writing, I told students, if I get to the end of your story and it turns out it was all a dream, I have permission from the provost to come to the dormitory and hit you with a wiffle bat. it's very annoying to read 10 pages and, it was
I
all
know.
a
It was
dream.
It's
all
just-
a dream.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
But that is relevant to what Lewis is doing here. He is making the point that God is not arbitrary and saying, oh, I like you, so I'm going to give you a miracle.
Yeah.
That there is uniformity. God set these natural processes in working order, is guiding them, and then sometimes speeds them up. But unless a miracle is celebrating God's own nature, we should probably be suspicious of it.
Yeah. So he gets to the last chapter, which is where he really talks about a specific miracle, and he singles out what he calls the grand miracle,
Yeah.
which is the Incarnation, which, Crystal, you love to talk about the Incarnation.
Yes.
And for good reason. We can't give you a hard time for that. It is the grand miracle. But he essentially says that the whole history of Earth is leading up to this thing. And if this didn't happen, then all these other miracles that we talk about, it doesn't really matter if Elijah turned and made an axe head float or whatever.
Right.
If God didn't come down and become a man and become Jesus Christ, then all this other stuff that we're talking about doesn't really matter if he died and rose from the grave. If it wasn't actually God in the flesh doing it, then he was just a guy in the first century dying. So what does Lewis say in this last chapter? Why is the Incarnation the grand miracle, and what is it? What is the story that it's telling?
Boy, that is a good question.
I know, right?
Well, he starts out by defining miracles as interference of the divine in the natural course of things.
Yeah.
And the ultimate interference is the Incarnation,
Yeah.
the ultimate interjection of the divinity into the human course of events. And that helps us understand and reinterpret all the miracles that came before and all those that come after.
Yeah.
So I think it's a beautiful rhetorical strategy to say if you believe in the grand miracle, then you should be open to other ways in which God could be influencing the uniformity of the natural world
Yeah.
for
Right.
his purposes.
Right. And I loved that suggestion that he made in terms of uniformity. So some naturalists might say, well, the idea of resurrection, that's absurd. But then Lewis suggests, well, scientists are already saying that atoms from the past have been resurrected in us, so that each of us here might have little atoms that were from people who died in the 16th century that have been reconstituted
Yeah.
in our own bodies.
Yeah.
So once again, the nature of creation then is fulfilled through the death and resurrection of Jesus, is just sped up.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that he mentions the doctrine of recapitulation. So this is an
Yeah.
early church idea that was put forward by, I believe, is Irenaeus. And it's this idea that Christ in the Incarnation takes up all of humanity and all of creation into himself, including even the past. It recapitulates all of creation in himself. And Lewis has a line in this chapter. He says that Christ, that the divine comes down, and he says, down further still, if embryologists are right, to recapitulate in the womb ancient and pre-human phases of life, down to the very roots and seabed of the nature he has created. But he goes down to come up again and bring the whole ruined world up with him. And so it's this idea of this pattern of vegetable life. We put things in the ground and they grow back up. And animals go into the womb and then they come out. And that we see this in the Incarnation. And it makes sense because all of creation is saying that this is the way things work. And we just see this grand example of it in the Incarnation. But that idea, after he's gone through all this trouble of sort of arguing against evolution being this irrational process, he then says, Christ in the womb, if embryologists are right, is sort of recapitulating all these phases of existence, because in the womb we look like a chicken and we look like all these other creatures, but then out comes a man, the sort of highest example of creation. And so I really like that what he points out in the chapter there.
He calls it the principle of descent and reascent.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so God descends to become a human being and live on earth, and then dies and is resurrected, and then he reascends. But except a corn of wheat go into the ground and die, it cannot live again.
Yeah.
And as you just said, what's that saying they always told you in high school chemistry, like ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny?
Yes.
That somehow the stages of the fetus, you seem to be almost reenacting evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that idea, the principle of descent and reascent.
Yeah. But I like the way that Lewis approaches not just that, but pretty much everything that we observe in culture and these other forms of religion. Rather than trying to attack them, he tries to find ways in which they all point to this transcendent truth that's revealed in Christ and that we see revealed in Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a very hopeful and optimistic way to approach these things, especially when you're having discussions with people who don't believe. Rather than attacking everything head on, you find the good in it. Even he can find the good in pantheism and say, yeah, it's close, but it's just a start. We need to actually get to the adult version of that.
Right.
Rather than just attacking it as this horrible thing and then saying, well, you got to substitute something entirely. He finds the kernel of goodness or truth in it and then says how that points to Christ. Like he talks about the corn king, and he says, you know, the corn king is a real pattern that we observed, but it's the pale image, the shadow of the real thing, of Christ, you know, who actually came and died and went into the ground and came back out again.
Isn't that interesting? I didn't know it until I read Lewis's book, that the Jews did not have a dying God myth the way other cultures surrounding them had.
Right. It's interesting that they're like the least likely culture to come up with a historical event in which God dies and comes back to life.
Yeah. What also impressed me, gave me new thoughts, is how Lewis in this book emphasized the importance of the ascension. That doesn't get talked about much among Christians because we kind of don't know what to do with it. But he said this is an important event because it proves the grand miracle, the Incarnation, that if the post-resurrection Jesus was just kind of this apparition, this ghost that people saw, he could have just disappeared.
Yeah.
But he was he was a resurrected body. And so the body had to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And so he ascends into heaven.
Yeah.
He loved metaphors of descent and reascent.
Yeah.
At one point, he says Jesus was like a pearl diver, that he has to go way down into the murky depths in order to capture this priceless thing and bring it back to the surface. Another place, he says he's like a strong man who has to get underneath a cart and bring it up on his shoulders. It sounds to me like Jean Valjean in Les Miserables.
Yeah.
But he loved to think of metaphors of descent and reascent.
Yeah. One of his great lines in that diving down to the bottom, he calls it the salt and oozy bottom of creation.
Right.
Ah, that is so poetic. So here you are in the midst of a book that is presenting a philosophical position, but true to Lewis, he's at his best when he sees the power of creative metaphor.
Yeah.
That's what helps us think in new ways.
Yeah, he also gives the example of this principle of the higher coming down into the lower, and that it's not a problem for the higher being to accommodate the lower being. It's the problem is the other way around. And so he gives the example of like dealing with like a kitten or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, and there's you can't communicate with it in the same way that I can, you know, communicate with you guys right now. But that doesn't mean that I can't care for it and communicate it in its own way. And so we often don't think of Christ or of God being that much higher. But it's not that strange if you think about it, that God could condescend, that he could come down and take on a form in order to communicate with us. And it would make sense that he would do that, because how else would we be able to communicate with him and have a relationship with him?
Although it doesn't make sense to other religions. I mean, other religions repudiate the idea that God would ever take on flesh.
Yeah.
But that is one of the distinctives of Christianity, which for me and for Lewis validates its truth.
Yeah.
That this is a radical idea that other religions cannot handle. They much prefer this battle between light and darkness, which is a battle between flesh and the spirit. Spirit's good, flesh is bad. But God sustains the same view of creation of natural processes through this grand miracle of the Incarnation, that flesh and spirit are one. And we experience that. We have a sense that our bodies and our spirits are unified. So that little experience points to is a sign, a semeion of this ultimate miracle.
Yeah.
I also like how Lewis mixes philosophy with psychology, because he'll be giving you a lot of good reasoning, and suddenly he'll say, you're sitting there thinking, and yet, miracles don't happen.
Yeah.
I don't see supernaturalism.
Yeah.
He's been so ingenious, but in a way, perversely ingenious. And I love how he reminds you that often we make our decisions based upon just the psychology, our sensations, our sense of what is ordinary.
Yeah.
And he's very wise to mix the philosophy and the reasoning with the psychology of how we experience reality.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it makes it more persuasive.
So this book feels very written towards a sort of mid-20th century audience. I would argue that it's not as relevant maybe to some modern readers because maybe they're not coming with that same exclusively naturalistic frame of mind.
Right.
However, what do you guys think are some reasons why people should read this, and maybe how should they approach this book in order to get the most out of it? Because I enjoyed rereading it. Again, I've read it before, but there is a lot of sort of philosophical. He's dealing with objections that maybe people don't have coming into it, although some may. So what do you think? Why should people read this book, and what would they get out of it? David?
Well, it is ironic because now I think the problem with a lot of people is not excessively logical or rational, but excessive credulity.
Yes.
There's a new book out called Strange Rights that says that people are changing institutional faith for intuitional faith. That if it feels right to you, I think 2/3 of Americans respond to the quote, I need to find the truth which is right for me. And they say they agree with that statement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it's not about objective truth. It's about the truth that's right for me.
Yeah.
So ironically, I agree with you. He's dealing with a more hard-headed, rationalistic audience that thinks the natural world is all there is.
Yeah.
I think in many ways, his metaphors and his examples stick in my mind more than the flow of arguments.
Oh,
Gotcha.
definitely.
I love one place so you agree with me on that, Crystal? Thank you. I love the place where a missionary is talking to an Aboriginal about grammar. And so, well, in English, we have future and past and tense, and we have first person, second person. Now, tell me about the grammar of your language. And the Aboriginal says, oh, we don't use grammar. We just talk.
Right.
And totally unaware that they have all these rules for speaking that they're not aware of. So I think the thing that I carry away from it is some of these really good examples more than the flow of the argument. I think partly for me as a Christian, I was already convinced in miracles when I started reading the book.
Gotcha.
So he didn't have as big of a job for me as he did for many others.
Yeah, you may not have all the same objections that he addresses in the book, but I think some of the chapters, like that horrid red things chapter, is very relevant because we use that to try and explain away or dismiss somebody else's argument, not even just in religious things. It's like, oh, I can defeat this metaphor, therefore I've defeated your argument. And no, that's not how it works.
Right. Well, at the time he was writing, there was a powerful philosophy called logical positivism.
Oh, yeah.
Which is every single word should be broken down into a logical component. So husband means male spouse. And they were very naive in thinking that there was little atomic meaning units, and you would bring all these atomic meaning units.
And just as long as you had enough precision in your language, you could be rational.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the woman who debated C.S. Lewis about miracles had been trained as a logical positivist.
Oh, of course
she
she had.
was a student of Wittgenstein's.
Yeah.
And significantly, Wittgenstein himself repudiated his earlier logical positivism because he came to be convinced, and this is the part, and you can tell because I talk about it all the time, that is so important to me is what I call the power and poverty of language. That we need to talk about God, but we have to recognize our language isn't as solid as God.
Yeah.
We have
Wittgenstein
to,
said, how can language describe God when language can't even describe the aroma of coffee?
yes, yeah.
Nice.
And I think Lewis would definitely agree with that.
He gives that example of a mystical limpet, which is
yeah.
this like mollusk, and it has this experience of man, and then he comes back to all the other limpets, and he's trying to explain to them what man is like, and he's like, well, no, he's not attached to a rock, and
he doesn't have a shell.
Yeah,
or
he doesn't
outer-
have a shell. And so then he says, along come the philosopher limpets and the theologians, and they take all these negative descriptions and turn them into absolute positives. And then you end up with this picture of a man who's this like amorphous blob that's floating freely. And he says, we do the same thing in theology because of our language. All we can do when we talk about God sometimes, this is kind of a negative theology. There's a term for it. Is basically say, well, not like that. What is God like? Well, not like that.
Right.
And he says you end up worshiping a non-entity.
Yeah.
And so,
Tapioca pudding.
yeah. So those limits of language, the power and the limit of language is sometimes we just kind of have to go with the best example of
Exactly.
maybe God isn't this old man in the sky with a beard, but Lewis says in the book that, well, maybe man is the best example, the most rational depiction of creation that we can come up with. And so it makes sense that that's how we would get at who God is. He's just this greater and higher intelligence, because that's the best example of intelligence that we have, and that's the best that we can do. But we know that there's a truth that is beyond that. But that doesn't mean that we should throw out all these metaphors, because you just get new baggage with new metaphors,
Mm-hmm.
One postmodern theorist, Jacques Lacan, describes it as the difference between reality and the real. And what he says is reality is what we understand as constructed by our language. But there is a real that transcends the reality that we can capture in language. The implications for Christianity are very clear. Another postmodern theorist, Lyotard, does something very similar and says that we are limited by the meta-narratives of our language, but then we get these little glimmers of what he calls the sublime, that there is something more. And it's very similar to C.S. Lewis's idea of sweet desire that drives his sense that there's got to be more than the reality that is obvious to me. There's got to be a real beyond reality.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you guys for letting me talk to you about miracles. It was good to reread this book and appreciate it from a new lens. I also was appreciative of all the quotes that he has at the beginning of the chapters. It made me want to go read some of those books. He has a quote from Charles Williams towards the end of the novel.
Right.
So it's always neat to see him appreciate our other Wade authors.
Yes.
Definitely.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Have good reality.
I can't top that.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.